So this is an IRIS module. Now, the IRIS Center put together these modules for educators around different special education and diverse learning support needs. These are all research-based and from very, very smart people within the field. So the way that the modules go is there's always a challenge. Oh, actually, let me pull this up. A challenge, an initial thought, perspectives and resources, a wrap-up, and an assessment. You can see that those are also listed above here and on the side here, so you can see where you are. So the module outlines the difference between IQ achievement discrepancy model and the response to intervention approach. And it also offers a brief overview of each tier of the RTI model and explains the benefits. So if you want to do this on your own, it'll take about an hour. And it's not required. I'm actually going to be going through it and kind of pulling out the important things. But if your style is you don't want to listen to me in a video, then I totally understand. So we're just going to go down to the bottom here and it says begin. We'll click on that and go to the next page, hopefully. There we go. So they always start out with a challenge. And so here we're just going to watch this short video.
As the middle of the school year fast approaches, the third grade demands for independent reading have increased. Mr. Hess, the third grade teacher at Rosa Parks Elementary, has become more concerned about the lack of reading progress in one of his students. Having tried everything he can think of to help this student, Mr. Hess decides to go to his school's support team, or S-Team, to get some assistance. At a weekly S-Team meeting, Mr. Hess tells the team that the student's cumulative records indicate that his reading skills have always lagged behind those of his classmates. Because third grade textbooks are more difficult, he's struggling to keep up in content areas like social studies and science, and his grades have fallen drastically. Mrs. Hernandez, an experienced first grade teacher and lead member of the S-Team, says they see this problem all the time. In fact, she believes that too many first graders struggle with reading, and she wonders how many students there are who end up like Mr. Hess's third grader, who is now failing because he can't read well enough. She's confident that what's needed is a new approach. Ms. Jacobs, the lead special education teacher, says that most of these struggling readers do not require special education services, but they do need some sort of additional intervention to give their skills a boost. Ms. Jacobs stresses that many students who have trouble with reading in the early grades continue to have problems throughout school. She adds her own frustration that the small percentage of students who truly do need special education services are usually not identified until third or fourth grade, because their skills must fall significantly behind in order to qualify. The S-Team members agree that they have seen these two problems over and over again. They decide they need to find a better way to get extra help to their struggling readers. In addition, there must be a better and faster way of getting special education services to students who need them than simply waiting for children's skills to fall so far behind that the kids are actually failing.
Here's also the list of the questions and everything. If you want to take a moment and just think about how you might answer those, then that would be, go ahead and hit pause and think about your answers to those questions. Next is just the perspectives and resources section. So here, by completing the entire perspectives and resources section and reviewing the accompanying activities, you're going to acquire knowledge about the discrepancy and the response to intervention models. You'll understand the benefits of RTI, and then you'll also learn about different approaches to RTI, and then we're going to go over one model of RTI and how to implement. More time. Okay, so here's part one around struggling readers. So we're just going to watch this 1-minute video.
In an average class of 22 first grade students, approximately 5 will struggle with reading. Of those 5 struggling readers, 4 will need either additional or more intensive instruction to remediate their skills. One of those 4 students will require even more intensive individualized reading instruction. These struggling readers are the ones who concern teachers and administrators. Of course, the numbers of struggling readers are different for each school, based on factors such as exposure to early literacy activities, quality of childcare and preschool programs, English language proficiency, parental income levels, and quality of reading instruction. But on average, across the country, about 25% of the students in the early grades require additional support to learn to read.
So as you can see, reading is a major barrier to student success. And you can see even some of these statistics. 40% of students across the nation can't read at a basic level. Almost half of the students living in urban areas cannot read at a basic level, and 70% of low-income fourth grade students cannot read at the basic level. Now this is really scary because we have the school to prison pipeline that is actually affected by literacy rates. And there is some evidence that if a student is struggling at reading at third grade, then they oftentimes end up dealing with some sort of legal issues as adults, and struggling also with jobs and things like that. So, really making sure that we're addressing these early is an important thing. So here is the IQ achievement discrepancy model. So we're just going to watch this video.
The S team at Rosa Parks Elementary believes that there must be a better way to help their struggling readers. They are also frustrated that so many students have to wait and eventually fail before they can qualify for special ed services. Rosa Parks Elementary, like most schools in the country, uses an IQ achievement discrepancy model to identify struggling readers who have learning disabilities. This is the traditional method which has been used for over 3 decades, so some of the team members assume that it must be a good approach. However, others wonder if the system they are using might be part of the problem. The S team members realize that they don't really know very much about their current process, other than it refers a student to a school psychologist, and then test results come back. They decide they should learn more about how the identification process works.
So now that we've watched that video, we're going to talk a little bit about what the IQ achievement discrepancy model is. So one of the ways that education or academia has decided to figure out if someone has a disability is by using this IQ achievement discrepancy model. The basic idea is that you check to see what a student's IQ is, and then you check to see what their reading score would be, and if it is similar, then you know that they're right on track, right? So you go back with, if you have a student whose IQ score is average, which is about 100, then, and their reading score is about 100, it's not excellent, but it's right there, then they're probably doing okay. And same thing if both scores are low. So say their IQ score is 85, but their reading score is about an 85, then that makes sense. And so then they're called a low achiever. Then according to federal law, you wouldn't necessarily help them out there either. Then you have the student who actually scores, or his IQ is about 100, but his reading score is about 68. Which, as you can see, are over 2 standard deviations below the IQ score, and quite below their grade equivalent. And this student would actually qualify for having some sort of disability and probably get support. And the big issue here is that then you're going to have all these students you're going to have all these students who, if their scores are too similar, then they won't actually qualify to get any additional services. Another area of concern is, and this video is actually quite good, so I would possibly go back, I recommend you go back and watch it. But another big thing is that you can't actually tell by doing this type of assessment whether the student has actually just received poor instruction or doesn't have access to good instruction. And so a lot of times students aren't getting what they need because of this. So we're just going to listen to Doug Fuchs, and he's going to talk a little bit about administering and scoring progress monitoring probes. So this is like mini tests to find out how well a student's doing in their course.
A lot of people have raised concerns about the validity of IQ achievement discrepancy. First, there's lots of ways of thinking about intelligence not captured by or explored by IQ tests. Second, IQ and academic achievement are presumed to be independent by IQ achievement discrepancy, but in fact are often not independent of each other. In the case of word reading, the capacity to read individual words, the skills that underlie that capacity, like phonological awareness, are seen as equally distributed across poor readers with a discrepancy and poor readers without a discrepancy. In other words, the cognitive processes that are presumed connected with early reading acquisition are virtually the same across groups that show an IQ achievement discrepancy and groups that do not. And so on this basis, people ask, why maintain the distinction? And then finally, and probably most important, is the criticism that IQ achievement discrepancy requires many, many, many kids to fail repeatedly before they show a discrepancy. The Office of Special Education Programs, in its annual report to Congress, has a very dramatic and persuasive graph showing that when the grade at which most kids are identified as LD is fourth grade. So their achievement has to sink far enough down so that there's a discrepancy. And that's a major concern of IQ achievement discrepancy.
So here is just a summary of concerns about the IQ achievement discrepancy model. I'm going to allow you to read these, so go ahead and pause the video and read these, and then also the IQ advantages of IQ achievement discrepancy. So go ahead and take a look at those. So here we have the Rosa Parks team again, and we're going to learn about the response to intervention approach. And I'll just play this video.
Now that the S-Team understands why using the IQ achievement discrepancy model often results in students having to wait a long time before receiving services, they wonder if there is a different approach to use. Ms. Jacobs, the special ed teacher, and Mrs. Hernandez, the S-Team's lead teacher, attend a professional development meeting conducted by their state's Department of Education, where they learn about a different method that is now allowed by the special education law that was passed in 2004. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, or IDEA. They tell the S-Team about response to intervention, which has two purposes: to provide early support to students who are having academic difficulties, and to offer an alternative to the discrepancy model.
So the next piece to response to intervention is the idea that we have to start with high quality instruction. And so in order for that to happen, curriculum and instruction, in order for that to happen, you need to use scientifically based, evidence-based, or research-validated instruction. There is actually a website called What Works Clearinghouse that will tell you what evidence-based practices are out there. So for example, if I am looking at working on literacy skills, then I can click on this website and hopefully it will load soon. It's on the slower side right now. And then you can read about these different reading programs and see if maybe the one that your district is using is listed here. So we'll look at Read 180, which is used in a few districts. And you can see that for some things, there is some evidence that it works. So there's 6 studies that meet the standards around comprehension. 6 studies that have an effect around literacy and also reading. Alphabetics was not met, but it wasn't not met either. So anyway, you can see that this is a pretty good program if a district was going to adopt it. So that's one piece, is just making sure that you've got good curriculum, good instruction in your classroom. The next piece is to monitor your struggling students. and then determine whether they're showing any sort of growth, which we call responsiveness, to the types of implementations that you are, or interventions that you are trying in your class. And so there's a few ways to do this. And one of them is to start out with a universal screening. So basically, you're going to go through and give all of your students the same screening measure. Universal meaning everyone. And then the students who are not able to be as successful with that, or maybe they've struggled in some part of your universal screening, then you will identify them as, students who might need additional supports within your within the intervention that you're, or the curriculum and instruction that you're putting into your classroom. So for those Tier 1 students, that'll be about 80% of your students. Remember that triangle that we talked about? They're going to receive the effective research-validated instruction in the general education class. And then you'll monitor the progress of these students on a weekly basis. Then you're going to move into Tier 2. If the student isn't successful, because you've been monitoring them on a weekly basis and you realize, you know what, they're not actually improving at the same rate as the other students, then you are going to try some different interventions, some additional supports. This is about 10%, sometimes 15% of the students you might have to do this. So this could be kind of a pull-out, small group instruction around some concept that you're teaching. It could be additional support as you walk around the room. It could be flashcards so that they can learn whatever that skill is. And you'll continue to monitor their progress and keep track. Is their progress, are they improving? Are they getting worse? Or are they staying the same? And if for some reason, even after you try these different interventions, that they still need some additional support, then you move them up into possibly Tier 3. This is only about 5%, 1 to 5% of the students in a school. And here is where you have now, demonstrated, and you have the data to prove that the Tier 1 and Tier 2 interventions were not helping. And so now you've got evidence and some support for moving into Tier 3, which is more intensive. And this could possibly mean that you assess them to see if they would qualify and benefit from special education services. Or maybe you are able to get them some sort of reading specialist that comes in and works with them in a higher level. So just to kind of go over, IDEA, the special education law, used to say that you had to use the IQ discrepancy model. But then they realized that they were missing a lot of students and waiting too long to identify students as having a disability. So they also gave the option of using response to intervention approach. And so you can just go through this. You can pause if you'd like to, just looking at the difference between the two. And continuing to look through the difference. Oh, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, but I wanted to mention it here. One of the other reasons for the discrepancy model being taken out of use was because there was actually a court case that looked at the IQ test for African American students, and it was decided that you actually could not use IQ tests to determine whether an African American student needed IEP supports, so special education supports. So that was actually a huge change too. So we had to figure something else out. All right, so the rationale for RTI, so early intervention and identification of learning disabilities. So we're going to watch another one of these Rosa Parks videos.
The Rosa Parks S-Team members are comfortable with the IQ achievement discrepancy model used to identify students with learning disabilities. The process is pretty straightforward. Students are referred, tested by a diagnostician, and identified as having a disability or not. However, the S-Team members wonder if the RTI model can solve some of their frustrations. They like the fact that the RTI model can get help to struggling readers early, and it can be used to identify students who have learning disabilities. so they want to learn even more about it. The S-Team wonders whether RTI is an approach that could bring help to students like the poor reader in Mr. Hess's class, so that they won't struggle for years before receiving more intensive instruction and supports. The team has many questions about how RTI might benefit their students, and whether it would impact the timeline for the provision of special ed services.
Okay, so we now have the rationale. And I will let you pause this and just kind of read it, but the gist is that it encourages and guides professionals to intervene earlier. And so then hopefully you're not holding students back who could benefit from additional supports. And then also it's better at figuring out if a student has a learning disability, because there's a lot less false positives. So the two big things are, of course, early intervention and identification of learning disabilities. If you'd like to, you can pause at any time and go through and read these. But we're going to listen to Larry Wexler.
There is some confusion because there are some very similar words being used based on the legislation. Let me start with the term early intervention. Early intervention under the IDEA has a very specific meaning. It's referring to our Part C Infant and Toddlers program, which is a program that addresses the needs of infants and toddlers birth up to age 3. And it's a family-based program that is similar to special education, but is much more family-based. So when we say early intervention, what we're referring to is the infant and toddlers program. Now, when we say early intervening, that's taking on multiple meanings. Most teachers, when they hear early intervening, they essentially take it as getting to kids as early as they can, getting to them before they fail. That's sort of the early intervening generic approach. But early intervening under IDEA 2004 also has a very specific meaning. It refers to services that can be provided that are scientifically based services in the area of academics and behavior. And these are services that are provided to children prior to them being identified as needing special education.
So we'll go back to our friends at Rosa Park.
The S-Team members now think that RTI might solve the problems they have faced, trying to expedite help to students with weak reading skills. They also think that RTI may well solve many of their frustrations with the current method for identifying students with learning disabilities. But the S-Team has more decisions to make. Ms. Jacobs tells her colleagues that there are a couple of approaches to RTI being used across the country, and even in different districts in their state. Before moving forward, the team needs to learn more about the two basic approaches to RTI. One is called the problem-solving approach. The other is called the standard protocol approach.
So here we go. We've got the two approaches that we're going to go through now. So here is the problem-solving approach to RTI, and this one is where the educators walk through in each tier illustrated by the figure. And for each student of concern, a school-based team of professionals, sometimes called a student support team or teacher assistant team, works together. So they identify the problem and determine its cause, then they develop a plan to address this problem, they implement the plan, and then they monitor the progress and evaluate whether the plan was effective or not. This is, so basically you do the universal screening so you know where your students are, and then tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, depending on how well the student does with each one of the interventions that came from the team. The standard protocol approach has the same model of universal screening, then tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. But it is looking at standard where it's consistent and the same for all students. So it's not individualized depending on the student. So there's a protocol, and the option uses one validated intervention selected by the school to improve the academic skills of all the struggling students. Because of this is a single consistent intervention, it is easier to make sure that it's been implemented with fidelity. That way, by that we mean that it's been implemented exactly how it was meant to be implemented. So the prompts and assessments and the way that it was taught were exactly correct. So there's a lot of positives to that. With the problem solving, there's a lot of room for the teacher to possibly make some adaptations or alter something around the plan, which then in turn helps the student or actually hurts the student in achieving. So you can see that those two types of approaches, you can see both of them have the universal, then both of them have the frequent progress monitoring, but in tier 2, one, the problem solving, the school or the group, the team decides on what the intervention is, and the standard, the school has decided on what the intervention is. But then tier 3 is the same, that they, depending on this, then they might qualify for special education services, so they might be assessed in that way. So we'll just listen to Sharon Vaughn.
It seems to me that there are several advantages to standard protocols. Perhaps most important, we have evidence that standard protocols have demonstrated effectiveness with the majority of students at risk. And when these approaches are ineffective, we then have greater confidence that the students for whom they were less successful really require a special education or special instruction. Thus, when students don't respond to these standard protocols, it could be for reasons other than lack of instruction. That's why I advantage standard protocols in providing response to intervention. In my judgment, it doesn't mean that people want to give up the interactive problem-solving process of thinking as a professional community for children and about what practices make sense for these students. Nor does it mean that we will do all of these in the absence of considering the context in which children learn and the context of classrooms, communities, and teachers. But I do think schools that lead without a standard protocol type are vulnerable because they do not provide reliable information about discerning whether risk is a result of poor instruction or whether students have special needs. At this time, we simply do not know enough to say there is just one answer or one approach. It actually reminds me of a joke that people say, which is, before I had any children, I had one theory about child rearing. But after I had 3 children, I had 15 theories about child rearing. And I think it's very much the same thing with RTI. We can come up with one idea about how tier 2 and tier 3 are going to work. And then as we start implementing it, the craft knowledge from expert professionals and the day-to-day problems that come up with real children in real settings will give us the opportunity to adjust these approaches.
All right, so as you can see, there's always the fine-tuned part of actually implementing the RTI approach. So here we go, and we're going to take a look at Rosa Parks again.
RTI is conducted in multiple tiers or phases that increase in instructional intensity regardless of the approach adopted. The S-Team at Rosa Parks Elementary School carefully considers both RTI approaches. They are encouraged that the problem-solving approach has been used for several decades, and they really like the individualization it could provide to their students. On the other hand, they also like the consistency of implementation that would occur with the standard protocol, and they are impressed with the research findings that back its effectiveness. Eventually, the S-Team recommends, and the teachers and principal agree, to try the standard protocol approach.
Okay, so they went through and decided on both, and for the universal screening, they decided on a 1-minute reading. And one of those types of readings is called Dibbles, and so that one's very widely known and accepted, and you just have the student read for 1 minute, and you record how many words the student is able to read correctly, And then you also make notes about any words that weren't read correctly so that you can also address those. Then there's also the standardized test. So they use the well, your district may have some standardized reading tests for you to take a look at. The big thing is to ask. So here we go. We've got the Tier 1. So they finished the universal screening and now they've moved into Tier 1. And the classroom teacher is then going to help or do good teaching of reading, so using evidence-based practices to all of the students. So you can see that all the students, including the struggling readers, are all learning the exact same thing. Then in the Tier 2, we do the targeted for, remember, 5 of the students who were struggling. Then we might put them into a small group and really give some direct instruction on whatever it is that they're struggling with. And let's listen to Sharon now.
I think that over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to learn a lot of craft knowledge from the expert practitioners who are going to be doing this very hard work of implementing response to intervention. I also believe that over time we're going to refine how we define these various tiers and how many tiers there are. Based on what we know right now, my thinking about a Tier 2 intervention is that it should be long enough and intensive enough to give students who are at risk a real opportunity to improve, but not so long and intense that it's a substitute for special education. So, as a working principle, my model would be that Tier 2 gets framed and implemented in various academic areas like reading and math, and across various grade levels like 2nd grade or 5th grade or 9th grade may differ. For example, in the primary grade, interventions may be relatively brief, 15 to 20 weeks. As children get older, the interventions may be longer. But we don't want the Tier 2 intervention to be an alternative for special education so that students with disabilities are in Tier 2 interventions for years, rather than receiving the full benefits from the identification and placement in special education.
So one of the big things here that I've seen in schools is that students get into Tier 2 and the teachers don't monitor the progress, so the team can't meet and discuss whether it's working or not working. And so the very important thing here is that people are working together and they are documenting exactly what's going on. So next is the Tier 3. Now remember, this is just a small percentage, 1 to 5% of the students who would really need to, and 10% at the most, who would really need to get these Tier 3 intensive individualized interventions. And this is oftentimes done in special education. I'm not going to play the video, but you're welcome to go back and do that. But just keep in mind that these Tier 3 interventions should come after you have really demonstrated that you've done a phenomenal job with instruction at the Tier 1 and Tier 2 levels. So here we go to Rosa Parks.
Since it took a fair amount of time for the S team to decide how best to help their struggling students, the third quarter is already in progress. The professionals at Rosa Parks Elementary decide to implement RTI at the beginning of the next academic year, starting with their first grade classrooms. Let's take a look at Mrs. Hernandez's first grade class to gain a better understanding of the RTI process they have selected to implement.
All right, so they give us the universal screening, and most of the students actually performed really well on that. And so then she started the Tier 1 interventions, and remember this is a whole class intervention, by using the curriculum, the high quality curriculum that they selected. And she continued to monitor the data for 8 weeks to show progress or if there were students who were struggling. Then for those struggling students, she went through with the Tier 2 or targeted interventions. And she brought them into a small group and she continued to keep data on their progress. And in the end, it was only one student who really needed to move into the intensive individualized interventions, and that student was then recommended to be assessed for special education services. And at the end of the evaluation, it was shown that that student did have a disability and would need those services. So as you can see, there are all these parts to really understanding and working with students. And if you wanted to, you could actually go through and do this activity where you decide which student falls into which category. So if you do want to pause and put that together or go to the website, you're welcome to do that. There we go. And so just so you know, there's of course this module as a reference, and here's some of the resources and people who went through it. And you can see this is very, very comprehensive towards what we have available out there. These are some people that worked on this module. I like to give credit where credit is due. And just as a wrap up, please remember that response to intervention is a multi-tiered approach to education. And it does take more work for the teacher who needs to keep the data, make sure that they are implementing the curriculum and instruction with fidelity, and are providing high quality instruction to all of their students. So I think we are good. If you wanted to revisit your initial thoughts on the original questions, you are welcome to do that at this time.